Pirkei, Mishnah Tezvav, 5th chapter, 15th Mishnah. The very first thing that should strike you about this Mishnah today is, hang on a second, haven't we already done this? Because we've already learned that there are 4 kinds of students. Do you remember that? That was a loaded statement. Because the one kind of student is the one who forgets quickly, right? Okay, so it was a loaded statement. But we've already learned that there are 4 kinds of students. People who retain, people who don't retain. And now we're talking about that there are 4 kinds of people who sit in front of the sages. So what's the difference between a student and somebody who sits in front of the chachamim? Now, what's the difference? So let's have a look. There are 4 kinds of categories of people who sit in front of the chachamim. And let's just make this a little bit more fun. Let's see which one you would like to be. Okay? Sfoig. The first one is the sponge. Who wishes that they had a brain like a sponge? Yeah? Right? And we all say, children, little children, they just absorb everything. They have a brain like a sponge. I wish I was like that when I was younger, right? Okay, let's see. So that's the first one. Okay, Sfoig. What's the next one? No? What? Mashpeich. What's a mashpeich? A funnel. How do you say funnel in modern language? In one ear and out the other. Okay? Don't think anybody's raising their hand for that one. Next one. Mishameres. What's a mishameres? A strainer. A strainer. And then the last one is a sieve. Nofa. A sieve. Okay? So, out of all of them, what would you like to be? The sponge, the funnel, the strainer, or the sieve?
We'll say sponge, but I bet it's not.
Right? Because we know how this works. Just remember that all the Mishnahs we've learned until now, the first proposal wasn't generally the best one. We typically moved from, at least in some of the Mishnayos, the first 2 were kind of either on the 2 extremes or they were kind of missing what the other one had. And then when we got to the third person, generally the third person in the Mishnah was the best. And the fourth was the worst of the lot, which is not going to be the case in this Mishnah. Okay, so let's have a look. Says the Mishnah, Sfoig shehu soifeg es hakol. No surprises over there. The sponge absorbs everything. Everything. Okay? Mashpeich shemoitzi bezoi, shemachnis bezoi or moitzi bezoi. The funnel, exactly as we said, takes in on the one side and it spills out on the other side. So literally in one ear and out the other, or so it would seem. We're going to test that theory and see if that is exactly what it means. Mishameres, what do you use a strainer for? Says the Mishnah, Shemoitzia es hayayin v'koletes es hashmorim. It allows the wine to flow through and it retains all the dregs. Is that good? Doesn't sound so good, right? Nofa shemoitzia es hakemach v'koletes es hasoiles. Whereas the sieve gets rid of the coarse flour and it retains the fine flour. So that sounds good, right? You get rid of the less, so-called the whole wheat, and you keep the fine flour. So it would seem. All right, before we continue, let me tell you a story. And it may or may not be relevant to the story, to this Mishnah. So the first question that we had on this Mishnah is, we've already learned about 4 kinds of students. Why now are we learning about 4 kinds of people who sit in front of the Chachamim? What is the difference? We're going to have to examine that. Our second question is, out of the 4 categories over here, which is the ideal? You're going to find that 90% of the Mefarshim describe this Mishnah one way. There is a certain exception, the Yochanan Boyaz, who looks at it from a different perspective. So we're going to look obviously at the majority. Here's the story. There's a teacher teaching a group of young children at school. And he tells them the following story, a very well-known story, that there was a long-running debate between the Ramban, Nachmanides, and the advisors to the local sultan at the time. And the debate was the Ramban said you cannot change the nature of an animal, and they said that you can. The fundamental nature of an animal, the Ramban said you can't change, they said you can. So these guys wanted to discredit the Ramban in the eyes of the Sultan, and so they took cats, and they trained these cats over a lengthy period of time to be able to perform a particular task, and they were going to show this now to the Sultan and discredit the Ramban. Comes the big day, and they had trained up these cats, and they called everybody together. It was going to be this grand display. The Ramban was going to have to sit there, and just before the Ramban set off to this particular engagement, he took his big, fancy silver snuff box. Unbeknownst to him, a little mouse had jumped into the snuff box. He didn't know, he closed the snuff box and off he went. Now they're at this grand royal affair, and these cats had been trained to walk on their hind legs and to carry trays of food and act as waiters at this royal event, which is obviously really impressive. And these guys said, you see, the nature of a cat is to walk on all fours, and we have changed the nature. The cat now walks on two legs. And they were waiting, of course, for the Ramban to respond to this. So he needed to clear his head. So the Ramban opened his snuff box to take some snuff. Out jumps the mouse, runs across the floor. You can well imagine what happened next. The trays go one way, the food goes another way, and the cats are chasing the mouse. And of course, that was a great illustration of the point that you might be able to train an animal to do certain things, but you cannot change its fundamental nature. This is the story the teacher tells to his class. One kid puts up his hand. Yes, Yankel? Yeah, what's your question? He says, Rabbi, did the cats catch the mouse? What's the point of the story? Point of the story is that we've already learnt about different levels of intelligence. People who remember things, people who battle to remember things. Kosher lilmoid, it takes time to learn, but kosher la'abed, it takes time to lose. The person who quickly grasps but quickly loses. We've spoken about different types of intelligence. That only tells us what the person is capable of in terms of what they'll remember. It doesn't tell us the quality of the information that they'll retain. Sometimes you'll get people who'll walk out of the most profound shiur, and what did they walk out with? Did the cats catch the mouse? That's the conversation in this Mishnah. The conversation is not about how smart people are, the different kinds of people with different levels of intelligence. There's another bracha over and above that a person either does or doesn't have in their life, and that is the ability to discern the correct information. What does the Gemara tell us about David HaMelech? It says that the pasuk tells us V'Hashem imoy, that Hashem was with David HaMelech. So the Gemara asks, what does it mean that Hashem was with David HaMelech? Says the Gemara, Shehalocha kamoisoi, that he had what we call siyata dishmaya. He had divine assistance. So whenever there was an issue that was being debated, it had to be clarified, the halacha would always be in favor of David HaMelech's opinion, because he was so dedicated to Hashem. It's not a matter of intelligence, it's a matter of Hashem's bracha to be able to discern the right information at the right time. The Gemara in Sota tells us a very interesting story about when the Jews were in the desert, and about the bones of Ruvain that weren't settled in the desert. It's a whole story, but eventually part of the elevation of a soul, because that's one of the places the Gemara talks about the elevation of a soul, is that the soul should be able to participate in what we call Masifta Dirakia, the yeshiva on high. Now you think that's a great thing, you get access to the yeshiva on high. So then the Gemara says, but the next level of elevating a soul is that when you're in that yeshiva on high, you can actually discern how the halacha should really be taught. It's not just good enough to be in the yeshiva. There are 4 types of people sitting in the yeshiva. They're sitting b'fnei chachamim. They're sitting in front of the sages. In Pirkei Avos, we already learned, remember, Yossi ben Yoezer ish Tzreida, what did he say? that you should sit, you sit at the dust of the feet of the Chachamim. They're doing this. These people are doing this. This is very significant because that tells you that the very first critical step to getting the right information is to be in the right place. What was the last Mishnah we learned?
The different people who went to
Right. The difference between the person who's hoileich ve'enoi oise. What happens if a person goes to the base medrash but they don't actually participate? Or the reverse, the person who does participate without going to the base medrash. So last Mishnah told us that there's the possibility, and there's certain advantages to each side, and so there is a possibility of a person who doesn't go to the base medrash and they learn. Now we're seeing, yes, that's all well and good, but if you're not yoshev lifnei hachachamim, if you're not sitting in that environment, if you don't have the teacher, then there's a greater chance that you're actually going to get the wrong information, because even when you are sitting in front of the chachamim, you need a bracha in your life that you get the correct version of the information. So, at first glance, the way we read this Mishnah, at first glance, we like the sponge and we don't like the funnel. We'd much rather be the sponge. We wouldn't really like to be the funnel. It's not a great compliment to somebody to say in one side and out the other. It's really not a great compliment. Whereas if you say that somebody absorbs everything, it sounds like a very positive compliment, except what are they absorbing? That's the question. That's why it's the first one on the list, because just simply absorbing everything isn't necessarily an advantage. And what I love about this Mishnah, and it was similar in the last Mishnah, is that there's such a modern application for this. It's possible to say that one of the greatest challenges that we have in our modern age is information. Information overload. Sfoig. You take in everything. You know that story of the Rebbitzin who's eavesdropping on the rabbi when he's trying to mediate between two people who have a major argument? So the first person puts his argument forward. The rabbi listens to him very carefully. He puts his whole side of the story forward and he says, you know what? You're right. Then the other guy gives his version of the story, which of course is the exact opposite, and he tells his whole thing, and the rabbi says to him, you know what? You're right. So the Rebbitzin walks into the room and says, with respect, that's not possible. They're fighting, they're arguing, their opinions are diametrically opposed. You cannot say that they're both right. It's just not possible. He says, you know what? You're right. And that's the problem. That's a big problem in today's world. We hear all of this information. It becomes really difficult to discern what's right, what's valid, what's appropriate, what's according to Torah. I'm not talking about general information. That's a big problem outside of our community, right? People are overwhelmed with information and they really don't know what to believe about anything. I'm talking even in the world of Torah, in the world of Judaism, there's so many voices. The advantage is also the challenge. We have access to so much information, but do we know how to discern, number one, what is actually correct, alind with halacha? Number two, what is correct for us, what is relevant for us? Now, that's one of the big problems. Just because a particular halachic ruling or a particular insight is suited to or aimed at one individual doesn't mean that it's aimed to me. So this is one of the challenges that we have. So the problem of the sfoig, the person who is the sponge, is they take in everything. And when a person takes in everything, they could become overwhelmed to the point of paralysis. They land up taking in nothing. They land up having no value from what they're taking in. So they're taking in everything, and it's clogging the neural pathways, and so that they land up having no value out of anything they're taking in. So that's not such a good thing, right? You don't necessarily want to be a sponge. And we're going to come back to this a little bit later, because we're going to talk about our responsibility also to the people who we teach. And we all are responsible to teach people, whether it be formal students, whether it be our children, whether it be people who look to us for guidance. So we've got to think about this, because it feels very satisfying when somebody is a sponge. If you're the teacher. Amazing, look at this. They took everything in. And we've got to be cautious about that, because as teachers, And again, I'm using teacher in a very broad sense because teacher could mean in any position where we are responsible for educating or sharing. So we've got to be careful. The person is taking everything in. Are we doing them a favor? Which is why there's an advantage to the funnel, funnily enough. The Medrash Shmuel says, if you look at the design of a funnel, it's broad on the side that receives and narrow on the side that spills out. So yes, machnis bezoi umoitzi bezoi. Yes, it's bringing in information on the one end and it's taking out information on the other end, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's losing information. It's possible that machnis bezoi, in a group, you may have that person in the group who's able to absorb all of the information in the broadest sense, and then knows how to filter it down into a narrower stream so that they can then share with other people in a way that's not overwhelming. So it's actually possible that the funnel could be better than the sponge. Because the sponge is just taking everything into the point of being totally inundated, and the funnel is calibrating for other people. So the funnel is the person who's taking in a lot and sharing less. So the funnel helps. In every system, you need the funnel. You need that person who's able to assist. So you might have, for example, the university professor or lahavdil, the Rosh Hashiva, who gets up in front of the whole crowd. And then you need the individual who's the tutor or the person who's the Sholem Eishim in the yeshiva, who can help you just drill it down, bring it into terminology that is not overwhelming, can filter out the things that are going to confuse or that are going to be too much information and allow people to actually understand and to learn properly. There's another layer to this. Who says that the sponge and the funnel are so different? In fact, who says that the sponge and the funnel are even different people? Because if somebody is absorbing to the point of collapse, what happens? Everything gets lost. So they actually are two sides of the same coin in a sense. Because the person who's taking everything in is also the person who's retaining nothing. So technically, it's a funnel because it's a sponge. Because the person doesn't know how to switch off, they don't know how to discern, so therefore they land up losing information. You know, the problem is when we don't know how to discern, and that's the big issue of the sponge. When we don't know how to discern, there's another problem that arises. If we don't know what to take in, we also don't know what to keep. Because the human brain at the end of the day is only capable of a certain amount. I mean, yes, of course, we're highly intelligent people and we're very capable and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, we do have our limitations. Sometimes, I don't know how you feel, sometimes I feel it's like, you know, when you've got to clear some filing space in the brain to accommodate new information. So, you know, when things are coming into our brains, there are other things that leave. Have you ever found that? So let's say, God forbid, that a person's going through a tough time in their life and their brain is very occupied with managing the particular challenge. You find during those times, you just don't have the capacity for other things. You just can't think about other things. You can't be all philosophical when you're in a crisis. So in a similar vein, when the brain is overloaded with information, eventually other information starts to leak out. Which brings us to the next person, the so-called strainer. Now, the only person who has a different take on this, as I said, is the Yochin. The Yochin says, no, the strainer is a good thing because he keeps the dregs out of the way so that the wine can flow and go where it needs to go. But all the other Mefarshim see it the other way, that the strainer is somebody who lets the wine go and hangs on to the nonsense. That's the person who, out of the amazing story of the Ramban, all they hang on to is if the cat's caught the mouse. So they got the dregs. They lost the real richness of it and they got the dregs. Why is that? Because we overload our minds. Now, if you look in today's world, this could well be one of the most prevalent issues that we have with information in today's world. Because what happens in today's world, we're getting constantly inundated with information, but the information that we're getting is sound bites a lot of the time. So for example, somebody will share a clip and we'll all pass it on to each other. Did you hear about so-and-so, this politician, that individual? Look what they said. They're obviously, fill in the blanks. In our communities, usually obviously anti-Semitic. Because of look at what they said. Nobody goes back to analyze the context, to see the bigger picture. So what do we land up with? A lot of dregs and not a lot of wine. I'll give you another example. Really, really relevant example. Okay, so a guy calls me must have been about 3 weeks ago. I have a policy. Sorry, maybe I shouldn't say this loud. But I have a policy. If I don't recognize the number and I'm busy doing something else, sorry, leave a message. You know, if it's somebody I know, whatever, but I'm doing something else, so my message is on my voicemail. Send me a WhatsApp. The guy sends a WhatsApp. He needs to learn Kabbalah. Okay. Who are you? Usually people say, hi, my name is. And then they say what they need. He needs to learn Kabbalah. So I message back, what's your name? Give me some context. What are you trying to do? Turns out he's not Jewish. And a friend of his, and I'm still trying to work out who this guy is, a friend of his ostensibly gave him my number because I could give him the Kabbalistic formula that would help him succeed in business.
Oh my goodness.
Now, I wasn't quick on the draw because I should have said, of course I can. Please deposit X amount into my account. And then we could talk, right? I wasn't quick enough. Instead, I did the honest thing and said to him, I don't think you know what Kabbalah is. That is a classic example of something that's happened in recent generations, in recent decades, I should say, where the concept of Kabbalah has become somehow this mix of a cultish pop psychology, get your life in order by snapping your fingers, which is all the dregs, and nobody has the interest in the wine. So when I told this guy, well, if you learn Kabbalah for the next 40 years, maybe you'll learn that formula, he went to find another rabbi. And that's what happens. So I'm using an extreme example, but the reality is that it's quite prevalent in our society. Give me the bottom line.
Yeah.
Give me the executive version.
Nobody wants.
No, right? Nobody wants to invest. What do we call it? We call it Asek HaTorah. You've got to engage in Torah. It's like an asek, like a business that you invest in. It takes time, takes energy, takes investment, and then you'll get a result. In today's world, people are like, hey, just give me the download. And then I'd like to listen to it on double speed. What were you going to say?
I said, are these things automatically censored? Because the dregs might be good.
Oh, good question. The good question, right? Could the dregs be good? Now, we've got to be really careful what we say over here because we're talking about Torah. There can't be a part of Torah that is not good, right?
Yes.
All of Torah is good, right? Well, let's test that. Let's test if that is the case. So, there's a very interesting Gemara, very interesting, which says that there are two kinds of people who are mevalei olam. Two types of people who destroy the world. Okay, I'm sure if you look beyond the Gemara, you'll find more than two. But there are two categories of people that are mevalei olam, they destroy the world. Who are they? Talmid shehigia lehoira'a ve'enoi moire. A student who has reached the point where they are in a position to be able to teach and to render halachic decisions, and they refuse to do so. And the other one is, take a guess. Talmud sheloi higia lehoira umoire. The student who is underqualified and believes that they have the rights to be able to render halachic decisions. Is that Torah? Yes. Is it the dregs because they haven't yet matured the Torah into wine? Yes. What does the Gemara say? Mevalei olam. They could destroy the world. So it is possible that even Torah itself could produce things that are counterproductive for Torah. That's why the Gemara tells us very famously, Zacha nasa loi sam chayim. If a person merits, then the Torah will be the elixir of life. Loi zacha, and God forbid not, nasa loi sam maves. It's poison. The same Torah. So that's why we've got to be really careful about this. And that's why this Mishnah is talking about Yoshvim Lifnei Chachamim, because what keeps us focused and real and authentic is that we keep a Chacham in the picture. We don't run off and say, I'm now the expert. We constantly have the humility to go back and to learn from others who know more than us. That's how we ensure that we're not running away with the dregs thinking we have the wine. So that's really important. The ultimate state...
Isn't it also choosing the correct teacher?
Well, we have to have a little bit of siyata dishmaya also to choose the right teacher. So we can do our best to choose the right teacher, but we also need Hashem to guide us that the right teacher is really the right teacher, because unfortunately it doesn't always work that way. So, it's like the Yiddish expression. I love this expression. The Yiddish expression that goes as follows. Der Eibishter soll helfen. You've heard this?
Yeah.
Der Eibishter soll helfen. Hashem should help us. Und bis wird helfen, soll euch helfen. And until he helps us, he should help us too. Which basically means we ask Hashem that we should be able to learn properly. Part of that is to be able to have the right teacher. So we also ask Hashem to give us the right teacher. Okay, we have to at all times remember that Hashem has to help us. If we don't have siyata dishmaya, if we don't have Hashem's assistance, we can land up really well away from where we should be. So who's the best out of the four? The sieve. Because the sieve is the one moitzia es hakemach, who gets rid of the rough, the coarse flour, and koletes es hasoiles, and keeps the fine flour. That word soiles is used in the Torah. Where? Where do we come across the word soiles in the Torah? Which one? Korban mincha. A korban mincha, because a korban mincha is made out of flour. And when it comes to the korban mincha, it says that it has to be soiles. The Gemara says, how do you get soiles? You had to use 15 sieves to keep refining it and refining it and refining it and refining it. That's the key to learning. That's the key to this. Again, this is not a matter of intelligence. This is a matter of intention. If a person recognizes that when they sit in front of the Chachamim, it's not just that I sit there like a sponge, which is to be a passive absorber, not an observer, an absorber of what's going on. That's not good enough. And we like to do that, and it's common. We just sit there, bring it on. Like I was once sitting at Shabbos at our shul, at the Kiddush, and I had this whole drosha about how important it is to be self-motivated. Like you can't rely on other people to get you going. You have to be self-motivated. This whole talk, finished, sat down, and somebody turns to me and he says, Rabbi, inspire us. That's the spoig, right? The sponge, like, hey, bring it on. I've got to take it all in. That's not enough. And definitely not to be the mashpeich that just lets all that information run through. I'm going to download the next one, listen to the next shir. Like we're all guilty of this, right? Oh, I heard a wonderful shir. Next. It's not how Judaism works. Judaism works, we filter and we refilter and we sift it and we re-sift it. Why do we keep coming back every year to the same parashas? The other day there was a bar mitzvah boy that I was talking to before his bar mitzvah. So we got together, we had a whole schmooze before his bar mitzvah. So he says to me, Rabbi, I have a bunch of questions. Do you mind? And he had this whole list of questions that he wanted to ask, which was really nice. And I said to him, this is amazing. Where do you see this? It's not a kid in a frum school. So where do you get this? That a child turning 13 has a list of questions. Where does that ever happen? In our world, we encourage it, we inculcate it. But this is not even in a frum environment. Where does that come from? It was so beautiful to see. So what was one of his questions? He's like, Rabbi, and he had some really good questions, by the way, and they were on Pirkei Avos, by the way, most of them. One of his questions was, how do you always have something different every year to say when you get up to speak about the parasha? How do you have something? And it's a really good point. Because if we come back every year and every Pesach Seder is rinse repeat of last year, and every Tisha B'Av is like last Tisha B'Av, and every parasha is like last parasha, that's not Judaism. It's got to be the nafar, the sieve. What does the sieve do? You refine it, and then you refine it again, which means you learn, and you relearn, and you question, and you debate, and you go back, and you research. So that it becomes more and more refined over the course of time. That is the ultimate state of how a person sits in front of the Chachamim. And therefore, that is, again, it's not a matter of a gift that Hashem has given us, some level of intelligence. It's a matter of our intention, how we choose that we're going to approach Torah learning. Now, we also know that we go through different stages and phases in our lives and in our development of Torah. If this is addressed to the people who are sitting in front of the Chachamim, that means that there's a lesson both for the person sitting in front of the Chachamim and there's a lesson for the Chachamim. So let's try and find what those lessons are. First of all, the sfoig, the sponge. Now, I alluded to this right at the beginning. What is the stage of life where a person is most sponge-like? Children. Children take in everything. That means that children take in even the things we don't know were there. Right? And children is all the way into teens. You know, people always talk about when things happen to a little child and it's their formative years and what a profound effect it has on their life. What about when something happens to a person in their teens? It's possibly as and maybe even more formative than when a person's a little child, because, you know, we just sponge like we take everything in. So the two things we have to know about the sponge, something the teacher has to know and something the child has to know. And the child won't know this on their own. We have to teach the child. So anybody who's ever taught, and we discussed this once before, anybody who's ever taught will know that the easiest thing in the world is an A student, but it's not the most satisfying thing in the world. The most satisfying thing in the world is the student that last year's teacher warned you about. Because the A student is a sponge. And you've got to tell that A student and teach them, just because you're a sponge doesn't mean you've started your journey yet. Because if things just come into your brain and stay there, where are you in this process? What learning are you doing? What growth do you have? You're just fortunate. Things stick in your mind. So the teacher has a responsibility to the individual who's the sponge to say, never be satisfied because you're gifted to be a sponge. And the teacher has to tell the student, let's be very careful about what you're keeping in your brain. And when I say teacher, parent is exactly the same, right? The sponge is taking in everything. The person who's so smart, who's so quick, that's the one that we have to constantly check in with and say, so what's in there? What's in that brain? Because certain things will come out on a test, and many things you'll never know got into that brain because it's a sponge. So as an educator, whether that be a parental educator or a school educator, we have a tremendous amount of responsibility to the brilliant student, to the one who's taking everything in, to the one who's absorbing everything, as we do equally to the person who's at that sponge stage of their life. We have to be so careful. Like the Medrash Shmuel said, we've got to be their funnel. We've got to help them. We've got to help them what goes in and what shouldn't go in. And we have another responsibility. Very, very important responsibility. When we get up in front of other people, particularly people who are impressionable, we have to think a dozen times before we speak, because we have to make sure that what we share with them doesn't become the thing that they absorb that misleads them later in life. That's a huge responsibility, right? If you pause for a minute, I guarantee you every one of us could think of something we were told when we were young that only years later we discovered was either inaccurate or unhelpful or maybe even damaging. We all have something, right? We can all think about that. For years I used to believe, right? I used to imagine. So that's the responsibility, because when a person's in that sponge phase of their life, they're taking everything in. We have to be so discerning in terms of what we give them that we don't mislead, or worse. But then there's also another stage or type of personality, which is the funnel. That's the person who sits over there in the classroom and nothing's going in. Nothing's going in. Now, there are a variety of reasons why that might happen. One explanation is they are just not good at retaining information. It's possible. It's also possible that there's other stuff going on that's not allowing them to take in that information.
Could be anxiety.
There might be anxiety. They might be dealing with a crisis. They might be ADD. There's a whole string of things that could be making it difficult for them to be able to take in the information. And we just get frustrated, like, what's with you? Why can't you just remember? There's another possibility. Their brain might be so filled with nonsense that they don't have space for the meaningful stuff. So what do we do with this kid, or adult, or ourselves, depending who the funnel is? So the lesson over here is Yoshvim lifnei chachamim. Go sit in front of the chachamim. Don't give up. Don't shrug your shoulders and say, in one ear and out the other. We're not getting anywhere. The Mishnah started this conversation by saying, sit in front of the chachamim. And if it doesn't work the first time, do it again, and do it again, and again, until eventually, like Rabbi Akiva's famous story with the water dripping on the rock, eventually it goes in. But only if you're tenacious enough to do that. Right?
It's also not going in if it's the wrong person for giving the information.
That's true. It is possible that the teacher isn't a good match for the child or the student, not only the child. And that's why, you've got to be careful who chooses your teachers. But the point over here is Yoshvin Miflei Chachamim means you keep going, you keep trying, and you do it again and again. If it's not this person, you go to that person. And every single one of us is capable of finding that person who can talk to us, if that's our barrier. So it's really important to know that. But the lesson over here is you keep trying, and you keep going, and you go again, and you go again. Next level is a person that matures to the point where they actually start holding on to information. That's the next point. So the person, remember that there's this phase where everything goes in, there's a phase where nothing goes in, and there's a phase where we start to learn how to separate. So now we can already look at the difference between wine and dregs. That's a maturation, right? That's a person who's developed. So now they can start to look at the difference between the wine and the dregs. It's exactly at that point that we have the biggest responsibility of all. Help them work out which is which. Because initially, when you start to distinguish between different kinds of things that are more or less valuable, you could very easily, for whatever reason, either because it's popular, or because certain things resonate, or because they're easier to believe, it's at that point in time that people can start to adopt the wrong priorities. So we have a responsibility as the educator to say, let's help you keep the wine and hold away or put away the dregs. And I feel like the adolescent phase is where this is probably the most important, because that's the stage where people are starting to develop their own opinions, their own outlooks, starting to make very strong views about life, sometimes even extreme views. And it's at that point in time where if you have the right person in their life, it can make all the difference between what becomes priority and value and what is recognized as secondary or possibly to be discarded altogether. There's a massive responsibility at that phase of life.
So can one person be all of these things?
One person at different phases of life will go through, in fact, maybe even different phases of a chunk of life. So in other words, it's possible that a person let's say for argument's sake, just use an example, you go on a trip to Israel, right? One of these spiritual trips to Israel. So you could spend the first day being the sponge, take everything in, and by the third day of the trip you could be the funnel because you're completely supersaturated and overwhelmed, right? And then somebody hopefully is guiding you, what are you going to take out of this trip? So it can be in a lengthy or in a short period of time, and it certainly could all be in the same person. Now the ultimate goal obviously is to become the person who knows how to sift the flour and get the best of the best. Now, how do you do that? You go back and sit in front of the Chachamim. So there's like a loop over here. When a person feels, I've gotten to this point, I'm starting to work it out, I'm starting to get the right messages, what does the Mishnah tell them? Don't think that now you're good independently. That's not how Yiddishkeit works. The underpinning of Judaism is not intellect, it is humility. And if you don't have the humility when you've reached the point that I know now how to discern what is the really good stuff, if you don't have the humility at that point to go back to the Chachamim, that's actually when things can really go awry. And we have examples of this through the course of our history. Remember, we learned a few Mishnahs ago about Acher, right? Elisha ben Avuya was an incredible human being, and he was a great Torah scholar, and then the wheels came off. Because it can happen when a person doesn't recognize that they've consistently got to go back and connect. Rabbi Yehuda Anasi, the author of the Mishnah, says something fascinating about Yoshvim Lifnei Chachamim. It's not just to have a teacher or a consultant or a mentor. It's about sitting in their presence. So Rabbi Yehuda Anasi says the reason he turned into the great scholar that he became was because when Rabbi Meir gave a shiur, he sat directly behind him. So he could be in close proximity and hear every single word that he had to say. But then he says, if I would have sat in front of him and looked at his face while I was learning, I would have been far superior to what I am now. This is Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, who compiled the Mishnah. One of the greatest of all of the Tanoim, attributing his greatness to what? The fact that he sat in the presence of the great sage of his time, Rabbi Meir, and that's actually what added value to his learning. Now, it's really important also to know that in addition to the fact that these 4 different levels speak about 4 different phases or stages that we might go through, they also have 4 lessons for us. Sometimes you have to be the sponge. There are times it's appropriate to be the sponge. When is it appropriate to be the sponge? So there are 2 examples. The one is halacha ve'ein moirin kain. There are certain areas in Jewish law that while they are actually the halacha, for example, the story of Pinchas is one of these examples, that if a person should witness, God forbid, boyel aramis, somebody who's having a public affair with a non-Jewish woman, the halacha is you take the law into your own hands, but ein moirin kain. You don't share that halacha with anybody. So when Pinchas goes to Moshe and says, I'm pretty sure this is what we're supposed to do. This is the halacha. Moshe says, you're the man. You came up with the idea. Kraina de igrasa, ihula hava parvanka. You're the one who read the constitution. You put it into practice. I'm not telling you what to do. So even in Torah learning, there are certain things that are for the sponge. The sponge doesn't share. It only keeps it to itself. We have another example. The Rambam tells us that Ma'aseh Merkava, which are the great Kabbalistic secrets of what exists beyond what we could perceive, those you don't share with anybody except possibly a student here and there if they prove themselves to be of the caliber. You've got to be the sponge. You've got to know certain parts of Torah are not actually to share. Fascinating, right? On the other extreme, sometimes you've got to be the funnel. Funnel is machnis bezoi or moitzi bezoi, in the one end and out the other end. That means I don't even keep anything for myself. The exact opposite of the sponge. Sometimes it is that important for us to get out in the field and to go help people who have lost their way in their Judaism, who don't know anything about Torah. We've got to go out there and be the funnel and share with them without worrying about, well, what's going to happen to me? How am I going to retain anything for myself? Moshe Rabbeinu had that challenge. I can assure you now, Moshe Rabbeinu, when he came down from Har Sinai, would have happily been a sponge for the rest of his life. But the Gemara says, what did Moshe Rabbeinu do? Hashem gave him the Torah. Nohag ba tuv ayin. Moshe was generous with the Torah. Instead of just learning on his own, he brought everybody into the space and he learnt with everybody. He became a funnel. Whatever came in, he shared. Vaydaber Hashem al Moshe leimor. Whatever came to Moshe, he told to the Jewish people. There were no special things that he kept for himself that nobody else should know.
And the way a funnel is so refinement, it's taking a lot and bringing it into a vessel that can contain it. That's the idea of a funnel.
Right.
So it's taking a lot of knowledge and putting it into maybe a simpler form.
Correct.
So people could understand it. So it's not necessarily a bad thing.
It's not a bad thing. In fact, as we saw, the Medrash Shmuel says the funnel is not a bad thing. Where people hesitate with the funnel is, but what do I keep for me? Because even though the funnel is slowing or diminishing the flow, none of it stays in the funnel as opposed to the sponge. Then we also have to know that, and we've discussed this already through the course of today's discussion, that sometimes you've got to be the mishameris, you've got to be the strainer, you've got to know how to tell the difference between the dregs and the stuff that is good. One of the most important lessons about Torah is learning how to discern emes from what masquerades as emes. It's a lot easier said than done, by the way, because everybody thinks, oh, well, I know how to tell the difference. It's not so simple. There are very often subtleties that emerge in the Jewish community, in the teachers of Torah, or people who claim to be teachers of Torah, where they skate on the edge, and it's important for us to know how to tell the difference. It's really important. Of course, just to take it to an extreme, you get people who claim that things are Jewish when they really aren't. So, for example, I like occasionally to put things out on social media just to see what messages I get back. It helps sometimes even to prepare a shiur. So I put out, I thought it was just like a throwaway fun comment at the end of the week last week. I said, where do people who don't have Twitter go to get their misinformation? So I just meant it, and like a flippant kind of fun comment. In the meantime, I got the most responses to that I've ever got from anything I ever posted. People giving me real places to go for misinformation. So one person writes, this is what they write, the Talmud or anything else that doesn't support the Messiah of Nazareth. So I wrote back to the guy, where did you learn Aramaic? Like you claim you go to the Talmud, right? Where did you learn Aramaic? So people who propose that they have things which sound so much like Judaism, like for example, in today's world, people say mindfulness. It's exactly what Judaism teaches. No, it's not. It's really not. But it sounds like it's similar, so we say it's the same. It's popular right now, so we say, oh, that's no. Judaism is Judaism. It's Torah, it's Kedusha, it's holy, it's divine, it's infinite, and that's mindfulness. Something else. So we need to be able to know how to make those distinctions. That's the lesson of the Mishameres. And the last lesson, which is the lesson of the flour, the nafa, the sieve. So the Medrash Shmuel tells us that the nafa, the sieve, refers to the secrets of Torah. Torah is compared to bread. L'chu lachmu belachmi. Hashem says, go eat my bread. Bread is a representation of Torah. You get different kinds of bread. Bread which is made out of soilus, the finest of flour, that represents the secrets of Torah. The secrets of Torah, you have to know, like a sieve that knows how to filter, you need to know who and when you share those secrets. Not everything is necessarily for everybody.
That's